Hi everyone, I'm Mike and this is the Sunday Art Show. Now you may recognise this spot if you check out the channel on a regular basis. This is Bedruthan Steps and this is a beach on the north coast of Cornwall, and there are these amazing rock formations as you can see on the sand, just these gigantic rocks. Now last time we were here, a few months ago now, I just did a simple black and white sketch of the view from the top of the cliffs, but now as you can see I'm about to venture down onto the beach itself, and to access the beach you actually have to go through this gate, and because the beach gets completely cut off by the sea when the tide comes in, that gate is locked at certain hours. So if you're ever going to visit this beach then you need to totally check what the tide times are, because otherwise you're going to face disappointment. But going down this really steep set of steps here, now I don't normally suffer from vertigo, but this was so steep that you kind of almost felt that if you tripped and fell you wouldn't hit another step until you hit the sand at the bottom. But it was a pretty cool experience to kind of, you know, climb down this, and then less cool to climb back up it later. Pretty tiring, and the steps are all kind of uneven heights as well, so it's really quite a good workout. But as I said, pretty tiring on the way back up. I don't know if the steepness is coming across on the camera. I think it probably is. It's looking pretty darn steep there, isn't it? So I just wanted to share some of that with you, and kind of the experience of coming down from the cliff top to encounter this, you know, one-of-a-kind beach for the first time. And also the other thing, which I think it comes across a little bit better on my other camera, which I'll show you in just a sec. But the colours that are in these rocks is just amazing. There's sort of purples and blues and all sorts of different stuff. So that was really cool as well. So what I'm going to do today, so as I said last time we were here, I just did a very simple, there are the steps viewed from the beach, just to kind of give you an idea of, you know, they go all the way to the top of the screen there. But what I did last time we were here, I just used a black watercolour marker pen, and then I simply took a clean, wet, flat brush. There's one of the amazing rock formations up close. Got some more coming up here. And but yeah, going back to that previous painting, black watercolour marker pen, clean, flat brush. But today I'm going to paint this view that I'm just showing you here, and I'm going to use full colour watercolour. I'm going to do that back at home because I didn't take my art equipment with me on that particular day, and I'm working on A3 mixed media board. So this is mixed media paper with a smooth surface, but it's bonded to a thick piece of cardboard. So that's really good, because when you wet the surface it doesn't buckle at all, you know, it stays completely flat. So that's why I've chosen it for this particular experiment. So I say experiment because what I'm doing is I'm using this trip to Bedruthan, even though we were only there for about an hour or so, maybe a little bit more. There were so many different possible paintings from this one spot that what I've decided to do is gradually experiment with different techniques and work up towards sort of a really finished painting. So as I've mentioned about twice now, the first one was a black and white watercolour sketch, very simple, just some line work and moving the paint around. This one's going to be a full colour watercolour sketch and a bit bigger. So as you can see, having wetted the area for the sky, I'm just putting in some very loose wet washes of some light blues, some purpley blues, to begin to indicate this cloudy sky we've got going. So one of the great things about working wet in wet is that, especially with watercolour, it's very easy to create, you know, lovely soft edges, and you can get all these wonderful fluid effects fairly effortlessly in a way that you can't really do with other types of paint, in my experience at least. So I'm just adding some colour here and some texture to indicate the presence of this cloudy sky, and we'll come back and put some other layers of paint on in due course. But if you're slightly concerned about the focus of the camera coming in and out, that problem will solve itself in a moment. It's just when my arm comes across the screen, the camera doesn't know what to focus on, but as the painting progresses there's much less of that. So I'm using my big round brush, holds plenty of water and paint, and it also goes to a nice fine tip as well. So I kind of got the best of both worlds there. Big washes, but fairly precise marks too. You'll also notice that I've done a simple outline of the scene, and for watercolour work, you know, it's just a nice thing to do. Helps you keep things a little bit controlled. And what I'm doing now is with kind of a distant purpley blue, I'm popping in the far coast. So even though we're looking out at the Atlantic Ocean, the coast of Cornwall is so jagged and in and out. There are loads and loads of different bays and coves. So we're actually looking down towards Newquay, which is where Fistral Beach is. If you've seen some of my videos from last summer where we were sat on the beach painting, we were kind of looking in that general direction. But some purple for the very distant sea, and now coming in with a nice bright blue for the sea in the middle distance, and kind of a little bit more of that now, but a bit of line work as well to suggest the sea sweeping in from right to left. And then that's dry, and then coming in now with another colour, kind of a, this isn't quite the colour I wanted, to be honest with you. I was after more of a reddish orangey brown. This is a little bit yellow ochre-y, but it's okay. So as the water comes in over the shallows, some of the colour of the sand shows through. And now going back to a dark bluey green and popping in some areas where there are some lovely dark lines where the sand is wet. And you can cover a huge area with watercolour very easily, because obviously the paint is mostly water, so it's just so fluid. And the variations in thickness of the paint are exactly what you want with watercolour. You want a lively wash in general. Whereas with acrylic, it's much easier to put down, a more consistent layer and just do some nice flat matte colours. So one of the things I'm thinking of doing in the future when I come to do the worked up seascape, or in fact, when I come back to doing paintings of my farm animals in the landscape, is I'm considering doing the distant landscape in watercolour and then doing the middle ground landscape in thin acrylic, and then the near landscape in thicker acrylic, and then the animals fully rendered in their usual style in interactive acrylic. And my hope is that that will develop sort of the next stage of my artistic style, add a new sense of depth to my work, and just also widen my artistic vocabulary basically. So all these little techniques add up to allow you to create more and more images and effects, and that's what we're always after, or what I'm always trying to do anyway. So while I was chatting away there, I popped in a thin wash of a pale green on the top of the cliffs, and now I'm coming in with a nice orangey, yellowy orangey brown for the foreground sand, keeping things nice and loose, letting the paint do its own thing. If it dries in weird watermarks, that's okay. But I'm also leaving gaps of uncoated paper as well. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but if you go back to the sky for a moment, there's kind of a weird drying mark there, just to the right of middle. And initially, at least, I thought I would leave that as it is, but we'll see what happens later in the painting. Now, the idea here is to get as much of the white paper covered as possible and establish the composition fairly quickly, because then we can make better judgment of how one tone relates to another tone, or one colour relates to another colour. And having put in that lower third, lower half of the sand area, I've switched to a slightly different colour now to block in the middle distance. And the idea there is also just to have some subtle variation. You can see I'm wiping off the paint with the paper towel just to make that area a little bit paler. So even though we've got quite a lot of complex shapes going on in this particular seascape, I'm still trying to think of things in a fairly simple way. So I'm trying to think of foreground, middle ground and background, and keep the shapes and the washes fairly simple and clean, because we can always add layers on top. And you can see I put an even paler colour in for the sand for the very distant part of the beach there. And I'm now just dapping in, tapping the brush across the surface of those cliffs with kind of a purpley colour. So I mentioned earlier these wonderful colours that exist in the cliff faces here at Bedruthan. And for this relatively quick study, I'm not going to be able to spend too much time getting those colours exactly right, but I am going to be able to just experiment with different colours that have been inspired by what I saw at the beach that day. And that's one of the things I'm thinking about at the moment, actually, is where to take this YouTube channel in the future. And I definitely want to continue doing videos of this type, which are, maybe some of them are 10 minutes long, as you know, and others are, you know, half an hour long or even an hour long for the longer paintings I do. But even those hour-long videos, they're somewhat limiting in the amount of, in terms of the amount I can get done and the size that I can work on. You know, so there's no way I could do, you know, a 3 foot by 2 foot painting in an hour, in general anyway. So I'm thinking about, well, perhaps I'll start doing some longer form videos where, you know, I just deliver shorter episodes a couple of times a week, maybe 10 minutes of video, 5-10 minutes of video, so I can just share with you some of the larger and more complex paintings that I like to do. But we'll see how that goes. So while I've been chatting there, I've added in some darker purple onto the cliff tops, and the idea here is to simply try to pick out the shadow regions without getting too lost in the complexities of the texture of the cliff face. And I've carried that same shadow region into that little rock which crops up just in the middle of the beach there. And I'm now adding some darker areas to the wet sand where the cliffs are reflected in the water, in the very shallow water or the wet sand that's streaming across the beach there. Now, you know, technically the shadow colour I'm putting in, sorry, the reflection colour that I'm putting in here isn't really the correct one. But again, I'm using this as a little bit of an experiment. I've gone a little more reddish than I should do really for the colour that is reflected. But, you know, sometimes we get interesting effects by just letting go of expectations or convention and just trying something different. So I've added in a little bit of a reflection of that standalone rock, and I'm keeping that colour going into the foreground, applying it a little more thickly in a slightly deeper version. I'm just starting to add some shadow regions in the foreground here. So these little pools of water that we have in the foreground, they're obviously settled in little recesses in the beach, little holes. And because of that, there are shadow regions around the walls where the sand kind of dips down before we reach the water. And of course, people and animals and just the weather leave little divots in the sand, little footprints or little marks. So those have regions of shadow as well. And once again, there's not enough time to describe every single one of those in great detail, but we can indicate where they are and pick out the key features to begin to add another layer to this illusion we're trying to create, that this is a three-dimensional view we're looking at, and some of the things are much closer to us, and other things like the cliff and the distant coastline, they're far off in the distance. And yeah, this brush I'm using here, it's a really nice brush. As I mentioned, I think in the last painting of the belted Galloway cow on Dartmoor, you know, I can get such, and I mentioned I think earlier in this video as well, but it's worth noting again, I think, that it's so expressive and quick to use because you can use the tip or the side, or you can push hard or soft, and you can draw in such a variety of ways. It's really great. In many of my other videos, as you know, I like using a flat brush as well, and that's also expressive in its own way. So the combination of the two is something that's really good fun. But I've switched to a smaller round brush now just for the finer details. So I do try and stay with as big a brush as possible for as long as possible because you can just be so expressive and it stops you being too fussy. But there are times when you're limiting yourself by sticking with the larger brush. So I will switch to a smaller brush, you know, when it's needed really. So I'm filling in this this rock here, this standalone rock, this isolated rock on the beach. And I'm kind of moving my brush around in a kind of random way to deliberately create a bit of texture and different layers of paint to simulate the sort of cragginess of the rock. And for that same reason, I just pulled off a bit of the paint, bit of the wet paint with a paper towel, because that gives interesting effects as well. And continuing now to add a third layer onto these cliffs, going in with deeper shadows again. So we're just trying to create the illusion of a cliff face here, not trying to do an architect's drawing of every single angle and every single crack and cave. Just trying to give the impression that there's a cliff face here and that these are rocks. So continuing with that style, higher up on the rock face now. And so, you know, a watercolour painting typically comes together in a way which is very different to the way I normally work in acrylic. In acrylic, I typically put in the line work and then as soon as possible establish my very dark areas, and then I work to mid-tones, and then there may be further adjustment, but very quickly you can get a very strong sense of light and dark, because with acrylic you can just paint over it over and over again. Whereas with watercolour, we need to be careful to preserve the light areas, unless we're going to go in over the top with acrylic at the end or something similar. So with that in mind, I tend to work by building up all the light tones across the painting, then go gradually darker, but again across the entire picture. And so it's more difficult to see how things are going to end up, in my opinion. Whereas with the acrylic work, often within a few seconds or a couple of minutes, if I've got my composition right and I've got my tonal work right, I generally have a feel for how things are going to go. Whereas with watercolour, it's a little bit more of an exploration. Now, having covered the entire picture with these soft-edged washes of colour and patches of colour, I thought I'd switch now to my flat brush and use that in the way I would acrylic to introduce a little bit more texture into the clouds in the sky. And I'm taking that opportunity to also cover up those drying marks that I mentioned earlier. They're just, just where my brush is now, basically, in that sort of general region. I'm just covering up the top of that drying mark that I had before. So as you can see, I'm coming in with a darker purpley blue, still keeping my marks loose, but because we're using the flat brush, I can get some textured marks now in a very different way, and in generally speaking, a harder edge to the paint I'm putting down. And that's also partly because I'm using less dilute paint as well, and I'm also not painting onto such a wet surface as I did for the very first layers of colour. But I'm just kind of exploring really how these different types of textures will contrast when using watercolour. So the other thing we perhaps need to look at is how dark the sky is above the cliff face, above the cliff top, because there's not that much of a sense of light catching the top of that cliff at the moment, which is good in some ways because it does keep it pushed off in the distance. But I think what I'll probably do in a moment is I will darken that region of sky above the cliff top just to enhance the sense of light falling on top of that green part of the cliff. So a few strokes there up on the top left, coming down vertically to start to darken the sky. And while I've got that purple on my brush, I'm using that to put in some line work on the sea. And although I don't intend to do a great deal of detail for the waves that are rolling in from right to left, the idea of those dark lines is to start to show the little band of shadow you get under the white water as the white water cascades over the calm water beneath. So we'll come back to that area a bit later. And continuing with that colour, across the wet sand as well. Now, at the moment, this cliff face is looking perhaps a little bit wishy-washy, and it's just sort of, some random areas of colour. So that needs a little more work. And part of the area which needs work is the kind of greeny top to the cliff where the grasses are growing. So I'm adding in a darker, muddier green now for the shadowy areas of that. And that's helping improve the contrast between the sky and the cliff top as well. And as always, the handy paper towel, always a useful tool, especially with watercolour, just to pick up some wayward paint. And now I'm just putting a wash over the dry paint underneath to soften some of the edges that I put down previously. So that's something I do with acrylic. If you've seen some of my previous videos, is that by putting a mid-tone wash over a region which has been described with dark and light, you can just kind of soften the whole area. So it's just a glazing technique, really. That's all it is. And now I'm doing the same thing for the section of the cliff which is behind that first section. I'm putting a bluey wash over that, just to make those two parts of the cliff distinct from one another and to push the left-hand region back in distance a little bit. So that's helped make the cliff area much more of a coherent whole. And now I'm adding some very dark shadows to pick out the real dark areas where I just want to, enhance those shadows. So in particular, that sort of triangular topped rock that I completed a moment ago with the block of shadow. But part of the problem with going to bedruthan actually is that, you could do a painting, almost in every direction you look and almost at every elevation you look, because as you're walking along the beach, there are all these wonderful rock pools and things. When you look out to sea, or if you look at the cliffs themselves, they're amazing. If you look at the isolated, standing alone, huge rock formations on the beach, they're obviously amazing as well. And if you look up to the top, you've got these wonderful skies and stuff. So you could probably spend, a year there easily, painting every single day, and you wouldn't run out of material. You wouldn't run out of inspiration. It really is a fantastic place. I can't believe, I've been living in the southwest of England for as long as I have, and I only discovered it last summer, but very glad that I did. So I'm continuing here with my flat brush and adding in some more shadow regions with the purple. So the idea is that by doing this multi-layered effect, we can describe the main structure of the cliff face, but showing through below are rather softer and more subtle variations in tone and colour. And as mentioned, hopefully that will suggest some of the texture of the rock, rather than just having it as two simple washes. But the flat brush combo, or the round brush followed by the flat brush, that's quite a nice combination, I think, and it kind of follows through from the work I've done previously with the watercolour marker pen in previous videos, and just using the flat brush to move the line work around, move the tone around. So this is a combination I think I'm definitely going to explore in the future with my watercolour work. And continuing now with a thicker layer of very dark shadow on this isolated rock to help bring that forward from the more distant cliffs. And again, if you look at a beach typically, in amongst the reflections and on the sand, there will be the odd little areas or lines of very dark shadow. Often it's just because there's an almost black bit of gnarled driftwood or something which has landed somewhere. Other times there might be a deep gouge in the sand at that point, or a bit of seaweed, whatever it is. But we can just use those darker colours to start to bring some of the foreground forward and enhance some of the earlier line work. And while that's running out on the brush, just making use of the lighter transparent layer you can put down as well. And one of the techniques I love to use with watercolour is, or actually sometimes even with acrylic, is if I've put down washes of colour where the edges are soft and they've kind of wandered and wiggled and wound their way across the page, I'll actually sometimes use a pen or a darker colour on a fine brush to follow those outlines that have been created at random, to sort of enhance those delicious edges. And that's a really nice technique that I love to use in a variety of different media, actually. So now in the same way to the way I treated the cliff, where I kind of brought it all together with an overall wash, I'm doing the same thing with the sky to make it seem moodier. And again, that's going to help enhance the sense of light falling on the cliff top as well. I am, however, being careful to leave 2 or possibly 3 or 4 small areas within the sky completely uncoated with paint, because those are the brightest areas in the sky. So I don't want to kill the white paper completely. I want some sense of light. But again, going over with that purple wash helps tie together all that work I've done previously, makes the edges softer, especially where I use the flat brush. It just makes it a more coherent description of an expansive sky. So while I was just chatting about the sky there, I started to work on the foreground. So back to my big round brush, and you can see I've gone with much more of an orangey brown, a deeper colour, and I'm putting a second wash over the foreground now to help bring that towards us. It's a nice warm colour, fairly close to the colour of the sand that we had at the beach that day, and I'm letting that wash both describe the undulating sand with those wavy lines I'm putting down, And I'm also letting it wander over parts of the darker shadow areas, but not completely over the shadow areas in every case. So again, you get this automatic mixing of colours and creation of midtones, just quite naturally as one wash overlays another. And hopefully you agree. I feel now that we've got a coherent sky and distant cliff, certainly as the paint is beginning to dry back, and putting those darker colours into the foreground has really started to pull that forward. Back to the detailed brush now. So a little bit of hesitation here as I kind of warm up to slide I hadn't realised that I'd done that. Slide the brush from right to left. So what I've done is taken some ultramarine blue, a little bit of raw umber, and a little bit of white watercolour, all watercolour, and I'm just streaking that near horizontally across the wet sand area, because that kind of slightly muddy silvery blue you get is a result of the light from the sky being reflected in the wet sand. So it's quite a good way to describe reflections. And as you can see, I'm filling in some of the uncoated areas around that isolated standalone rock. And just, working across the surface of the entire painting. I'm obviously looking at my reference the whole time that I'm doing this, and looking back and forth and thinking, well, what do I need to adjust as a whole? And in the same way that I will squint at my reference photograph to kind of pull the tone and the sense of light out from all the detail, I'll do the same with my painting. And that same blue colour I can use within those little pools of water, which are already coated. It's difficult to see now on camera, but they were coated with very pale blue right at the beginning. But even within those reflections, even within the surface of those pools of water, the reflected light will have different tone. So there will typically be a highlighted area and a darker area. And that helps to make them seem more convincing as little pools of water. Now, so I'm switching here to some Inktense pencil, just to put in some little bits of detail for the waves coming in, the white water, the wriggly edges there. And some of you may remember actually from a few weeks ago I did some outdoor sketching of horses, and one of the comments on that video left by somebody called Moonram suggested that I could try using the Inktense pencils and doing line and wash, and then comparing how that works with the Inktense travel set that I was using in the horse video. And that's definitely something I plan on doing in the near future, so thanks very much for the suggestion, Moonram. I've only just acquired this set of Inktense pencil kit. Set of Inktense pencils. If you saw the little video on the Exeter art class I did the other week, you may have noticed that one of the guys there, he brought along some Inktense pencils. So that was actually the first time I got to use them very briefly, just to demonstrate the effects you can get, because I'd heard about them. And what I've done here is I've just popped a bit of blue in from the pencils below this isolated rock, and you can see you get these wonderfully vibrant inky washes that appear when you drag a wet brush through them. So as I say, once again, thank you very much, Moonram. I will definitely be doing that video at some point in the near future, the comparison video. And I'm taking my wet brush and just smoothing out or adding a little bit of colour to the areas I put in. And you can see, I hope, that some of those waves off in the distance there, they're starting to come to life a little bit now. They look more like waves than they did before, where they were beforehand they were just little slivers of uncoated paper. So once again, I'm straying away from convention here with the reflections in the wet sand of the cliffs, because these reflections should be much more of a grey blue. But I decided to experiment with my reddish brown with these pencils, and although it's not completely in keeping, I feel it works quite well within the painting as a whole. And I'm coming with the pencil here as well to just beef up the lower base of the rock there, because the way I had the reflection previously, the reflection was actually taller or deeper, if you prefer, than the rock itself, and it didn't look quite right. So by just making the rock a little bit bigger, it helps make that sit a little more correctly in the frame. And back in with the fine-tipped wet round brush again. It's a wet brush, just smoothing out some of that pencil work. So what I tend to do, you know, it does vary, but sometimes when I've got a new bit of equipment, some new pencils or whatever, then, you know, I'll just start out by, well, I'll just try a little bit of that in a painting I'm currently doing. And that's what I've done here. But I definitely do, as I say, plan to get into the Inktense pencils because they seem so versatile and so quick to use. The only slight disadvantage I can see at the moment is fairly limited colour range in the set of a dozen pencils that I've got, and not all that easy to see what the colour you're going to get is from the colour of the pencil. But you know, that's going to come with experience. So looking forward to doing that. While I was chatting away, just added in a few more bluey washes to soften that kind of orangey brown area at the shoreline, and adding some of those into the distant cliffs. So this particular painting is looking a little bit paler on camera than it actually is. So in a bit I will show you the finished version, you know, photographed in better light. But really loving the use of this mixed media board because it's so rigid, and you know, the surface doesn't buckle at all, so it's really wonderful for line and wash work. So that's going to be a definite candidate for the first few efforts with the line and wash Inktense pencils. And then coming in now with my orangey brown pencil. So what I'm doing here is going back to this outline idea that I mentioned earlier. So just in the foreground I'm picking up little edges of washes and just enhancing those lines that have been created quite naturally and quite randomly. You know, I did that with no intention, it's just the way the watery paint flows across the surface of the paper. And just by picking out little bits of detail, you can get these wonderful lines that you wouldn't necessarily think to draw yourself. And something I just enjoy doing. I feel it really enhances the foreground a little bit and adds a little bit of a unique flavour to the finished picture. But what I'll do is, as usual, I'll include a link to the high-resolution image of this painting in the description below the video. But this week I'll also put a link to the video for the previous time that I was down at Bedruthan. So, as I mentioned at the start of this video, the first video was just a black and white sketch from the cliff top. This one's a watercolour sketch down on the beach. And then my hope is to do a few more videos from this location, but gradually changing my techniques and making them more sophisticated from what I learned from my observations of different aspects of the coast here, and take you along the journey. So here's the finished pic. You can see to the left below the cliffs I've added a figure to give a sense of scale, and I've decided to call this one Looking South from Bedruthan Steps. So there we go. Hope you really enjoyed this video. As usual, please remember to like, comment and subscribe. Please remember to hit that notification bell so that you know when the next video arrives. And I look forward to seeing you next Sunday for the next episode of The Sunday Art Show. Thanks very much for watching.